Welcome back, everybody, to our studies in GCSE history, where we're going to do in this lesson a look at the Morocco crisis of 1905. Now, this is the first of the major events that really does give us an indication of where the First World War is going to be originating. Essentially, we looked in the previous lessons at what you could maybe describe as the more conceptual ideas, more conceptual foundations for the First World War, thinking about sort of rearmament across Europe, the growing competition between European powers. And this lesson is going to focus on some of the events that really shows that, not all is well at home, if you will, in terms of European powers and the ways in which they all dislike each other. And this sort of is elucidated by three crises that take place in the early 1900s. You've got two Moroccan crises, one in 1905 and one in 1911, and then you've got a Bosnian crisis in 1908. We'll get to that in the next lesson. So this lesson specifically is going to provide us with a basic background to the status of Morocco in 1905, thinking about the flashpoint, the point at which the event that sparks this crisis takes place. This is Kaiser Wilhelm II's visit to Tangier in March 1905, and then thinking about how it escalates into a crisis and then is ultimately resolved. And what this does and how this leaves all the European powers in a sort of sticky situation. So let's just begin firstly by thinking about Morocco. Morocco is a country in North Africa, and it is a country that in 1905 remained one of the few independent North African states. Its Sultan, Moulay al-Hassan, had adeptly played European powers off each other and was able to, at the 1880 Madrid Convention, was able to actually secure what we call de facto independence. So this might be something you might become more familiar with if you go from GCSE to A-level and from A-level to university, but there is a distinction between something known as de facto and de jure. De jure refers to something being actually legally the case, whereas de facto means basically factually the case, okay? So what this means in this context is that it might have been the case that the European powers had some kind of legal control over Morocco, but in reality, in fact, they were independent. They were basically independent as the result of the 1880 Madrid Conference. That's what de facto means. And this is a very, very unique situation for Morocco. Morocco is, like I've said, one of the only African powers, that is independent, that is not subjected to some kind of colonial control by some kind of European power. By 1903, however, the Sultan Abdelaziz, his successor, the successor of Moulay al-Hassan, lost effective control, was not able to maneuver the sort of diplomatic and political strategies in the same kind of way as his predecessor. And this was especially when it concerned a number of different issues concerning things like the Berber uprisings, which threatened the capital. The capital of Morocco is Fez. In April 1904, we note already that there is the Entente Cordiale, which was signed between Britain and France. If you remember back to that first lesson when we looked at alliance systems, I mentioned that this Entente was an agreement between Britain and France to essentially resolve a number of their colonial disputes. And so one of the things that the Entente of 1904 did was it allowed Britain to recognise French influence in Morocco in exchange for France recognising British interests in Egypt. Egypt was another one of those North African countries that had a sort of quasi-colonial relationship with Great Britain. It was sort of controlled by the British while also exerting a certain degree of independence itself. And Morocco was quite similar in the sense that it was de facto independent, but it also had a lot of influence by the French. But what's really important to note here is that we're talking about Britain and France as European powers dealing with countries like Morocco and Egypt. Germany felt increasingly excluded from this particular conversation, and particularly felt excluded about decisions concerning North Africa, and viewed this Entente, the Entente of 1904, as being a threat to its global influence. And so this is when we get the major event that sparks into crisis. Kaiser Wilhelm II, on the 31st of March 1905, lands in Tangier in Morocco and dramatically declares his support for Moroccan independence as well as the sovereignty of the Sultan. So he's not just saying, so they're sort of de facto independent, but he wants them to be actually independent. He wants them to be free from French control. Now, in reality, whether or not Kaiser Wilhelm II actually cares about Moroccan independence is, of course, a debate for historians. But at the very least, it gives the impression that he wants to try and rival the Moroccan forces against the French. He insisted also that there would be equal trade rights for Germany and demanded that there be a multilateral conference to resolve this issue. He sort of basically barges his nose into the situation and presents and puts his cards on the table as a European power dramatically supporting the indigenous population of the Sultan and the independence of Morocco. This, of course, was very, very provocative. This was a provocative open-door gesture that was also elucidated in his speech when he went to Tangier, and it aimed to disrupt the growing entente between Britain and France. The German diplomatic report emphasised the theatrical nature of the visit. So again, not just being there for the genuine desire to support Moroccan independence, he's also there to try and be as bombastic and as dramatic and as theatrical as he possibly can. He arrives on horseback in a procession, and his firm stance in asserting both free trade and equality with France was going to ruffle some feathers, let's put it that way. So Kaiser Wilhelm II comes in, he declares that Morocco should be independent, there should be a conference to resolve this situation, and the French react in a particularly negative way. As you can probably imagine, France's foreign minister, Théophile de Lacasse, strongly resisted the convening of a conference on Moroccan sovereignty, while others in Paris feared that Germany was growing in terms of her ambition. The German Chancellor at the time, von Bülow, escalated tensions by threatening war and encouraging the Sultan to resist the French reforms. So not only threatening war himself, but also encouraging the Sultan to basically go to war with French colonial forces existing in Morocco. And so by mid-1905, the French had cancelled on the 15th of June 1905 military leave. So as a potentially first step in bringing the military back together in order to actually prepare for a war. And Germany threatened a defensive pact with the Sultan on the 22nd of June. Again, very, very dramatic. De Lacasse himself, the foreign minister Théophile de Lacasse in France, was seen also as too confrontational and was forced to resign. The Prime Minister of France at the time, Maurice Rouvière, preferred diplomacy and in fact did actually go about agreeing to convene a conference. So Kaiser Wilhelm II gets what he wants with this conference, okay, believing that the outcome would result in French being diplomatically isolated, militarily and also imperially weakened, if you will. And so the conference at Algeciras between January and April 1906 was something that really Germany did not expect in terms of the results. Let's just say that. Germany had hoped for a compromise, but it found itself instead very isolated diplomatically, with the only country that stood by her side being Austria-Hungary, whereas Britain, Russia, Italy, Spain, and the United States all supported France. So again, this didn't exactly weaken French support, it bolstered French support. The outcomes included the creation of a state bank of Morocco that was backed by bankers and financiers in France, Britain, Spain, Germany, and the US, which would limit unilateral control by any one single power. That was a genuine positive change that basically meant that no one single country had the ability to interfere too much with Moroccan independence and with Moroccan politics, because all of these countries are all themselves contributing little amounts to this Bank of Morocco. There would also be the policing and customs administration in Morocco being primarily run by the French and by the Spanish, and there is also the protection of the Sultan's nominal sovereignty and free trading rights for all signatories. But for Germany, who's thinking less about Morocco and thinking more about international politics and thinking more about sort of the European state of play and the power balance in Europe, was humiliated by this particular conference and by this particular outcome, failed to divide Britain and France, which was her aim. Her goal was to try and divide Britain and France against this entente. Instead, it just strengthened Anglo-French cooperation, and so pan-German sentiment hardened, and denouncing the settlement as treasonous, and began to stir even further militaristic nationalism. This wouldn't be the last of the Moroccan crises. There will be one that we will see in a couple of lessons' time. But for now, I want to spend a little bit of time looking at the Bosnian crisis, because that Bosnian crisis in 1908 provides us with even more ammunition for how the First World War begins.